Okay, good evening, everyone. Officially, Amy Elke here from the Children and Family Services Training Center. I'm here with Dr. Stacy Benson, and tonight will be another great night of training, I am confident of, by all means. This is the second in our three-part series. Tonight we will be covering the topic of, but he seemed like such a nice guy, how sex offenders use grooming to gain access to children, trick parents, and discourage reporting. You know, not an easy topic, but certainly a relevant one, to say the least. So we're going to go through a couple pieces of housekeeping before we go ahead and pass it over to Dr. Benson to kind of get to that information. We have a number of new folks again joining us this evening. So I apologize for those of you who have heard this spiel over and over again of how you do indeed receive credit. So you can go ahead and scroll through Facebook for the next 2 minutes if you'd like, because I'll cover those details. But for those of you who are new and joining us, I want to make sure that you do indeed understand how we will be giving credit. So tonight, if you are attending live with us, we will be passing on a certificate basically through an evaluation. So with that evaluation, there is a downloadable certificate option. But also I can let you know that if you are licensed through one of the North Dakota licensing agencies for foster parents, we will be issuing kind of a complete list of attendees that we are able to gather by your login. So when I say login, that is indeed kind of the name that you registered for. So if we do have two-parent households, I would highly encourage you to make sure that your spouse or your significant other's name is listed with you as kind of that login, sign in. And if not, I would ask that you kind of put that in the chat box. So now the chat box we'll talk about in a minute, but just make sure that your name is listed in one of those two areas. And worst case scenario, if you can't figure either of those out, because sometimes technology is on our side, sometimes it's not, right? If you can't figure that out, go ahead and shoot me an email. You can just respond to kind of the link that you were given tonight to tune in, and I can make sure that both of your names are listed. So we will pass along that completion certificate to both kind of all our licensing agencies. So I shouldn't say both, because we have a number of licensing agencies, right? We have our zones, PATH, LSS, YouthWorks, our tribal partners. All of those licensing agencies can indeed get access to this list, so your training hours can count and be verified through that. Now, if you are one of those folks who is tuning in on our recording, with that, we ask that you connect personally with your licensing worker to kind of obtain credit. So with that, you guys can formulate your own plan of how you want to work out that credit. Sometimes they ask that you kind of email a summary. Sometimes it's a conversation. Every licensing agency kind of does that a little bit different. So I would just encourage you to connect with your licensing worker and formulate that plan. If you have any issues or concerns, certainly reach out and we can work with that. Okay, so when we talked about that chat box, the chat box usually is pretty easy to find. With that, it's kind of a nice little bubble that you should be able to click on and type in your comments, thoughts, questions. If you have a significant other that you need to type in their name, go ahead and put that in there. For those of you who joined us for the first of this series, you know that Dr. Benson is very open to those questions. I know in our last session, we kind of took some formal pauses and then the questions came flooding in. I would really encourage you, if you have questions as we're going tonight, to please go ahead and type those in the chat box. And if it seems relevant, Dr. Benson has said it's okay for me to kindly interrupt. And if not, if I kind of feel like it can wait a little bit, then we'll wait till kind of one of those more so formal breaks where we can go ahead and ask those questions. So be sure to use that chat box. The chat box is also a nice place for folks who are needing social work CEUs, that you can go ahead and put that in there as well. So that is kind of how we will utilize the chat box tonight. Because we have so many folks, I'm seeing 183, I'm thinking, households, which definitely probably puts us over that 250 people in attendance, which is very similar to our last session. With that being said, sadly, the only cameras, I would love to have everyone else have their cameras on tonight, because I will maybe speak for Dr. Benson and myself. I'm not a fan of just having a camera on me. I would love to if we could really interact and have more of kind of a one-on-one conversation with you as well. but with 250 people, it just isn't possible. So tonight we do only are going to allow that notion of myself and Dr. Benson to have cameras as well as kind of microphone access. So everyone else will kind of be in listen only mode. So I really encourage you to use that chat box if you have thoughts, comments, kind of questions, that sort of thing. Okay, last but not least, I'm gonna do our pause, okay? So tonight we are covering another very important topic, as we've already stated, but with the topic, you know, I don't know if it's just more so prevalent in North Dakota or the Midwest or the whole country, right? The whole talk of sexuality, of sexual abuse, in that regard, it's a hard topic, right? Interestingly enough, we've talked about covering this topic for a number of years, and you know, it's kind of been put on the back burner. And I think sometimes it's because folks, whether it's you know, those from the training side or those from the attendee side, have said, "Oh, we'll get to that type of thing." And you know what? Sometimes an online platform can be the easiest way to have part of this conversation, right? It's kind of like those of us who have maybe had to have the talk, right, within our households with those kiddos, and sometimes we want to go, "Hey, tag you're it" to our significant other, or can anyone else have that conversation, right? These are very important conversations, as we all know, and tonight is going to be very much an important conversation about how are we aware of those grooming signs, kind of the rest of the story. How do we have kind of appropriate flags raised if need be. But with that being said, part of our conversation may trigger kind of some of our own personal history or pieces that we've maybe experienced with youth in our care. And I would just really encourage you to utilize your own personal support system if need be, as well as possibly your child's caseworker as well, to kind of foster some conversations depending on what comes out from this evening's conversation. So it's my little pause just for self-care, and just be cognizant of those emotions that this may bring forward, right? Hard conversations, but we know those of you who are sitting here tonight, right, you're involved in child welfare, so you already are doing a remarkable job of showing up for those harder moments, by all means. So with that, I'm going to pass you off to the very knowledgeable, intense training that we are going to receive from Dr. Stacy Benson. So I will go ahead and stop sharing my screen, and then I'm not going to probably go into detail as I like maybe normally would in kind of giving that overall introduction. Of course, Dr. Benson is the president and CEO of Benson Psychological Services, and has a wonderful, wonderful variety of experiences. And I feel very confident in passing you off in her hands. So thank you very much for everyone joining us, and I will pass you off to Dr. Benson.
Wonderful, thank you very much. Let's see, I am going to share my screen here real quick. Why do I have more than one up there when I do that? Okay, this should be right. Everybody can, thumbs up? Okay. So again, Amy, I think you covered, you know, all of the important bases for that. It is always a conversation that can bring up different emotions for folks based on their own experience of people that they love and care for. And so please, you know, just be prepared for that and be willing to reach out if you do have any ongoing reactions. Also, please feel free to ask questions as we go. You might have some questions that are going to be covered a little bit later in the evening, and I might say that's a good question, but let's put that off for now. Or it might be a really good time to have those conversations. I will put in a break at some point, just in case people have questions and they haven't had an opportunity to ask them yet, or they were waiting to see if there would be a better time. So I do want to make sure that we have time for that. This is a topic that is very near and dear to my heart. It is one of the ways that got me started working with offenders. My goal, my career path had always been to work with children who were victims of abuse. I had done all of my early training with that. I had done all of my all of my graduate school in that area. And then I really took a little bit of work at a sex offender treatment program only to get a better understanding of grooming, and only so that it would help me be a better therapist for the kiddos that I was working with. And then through a series of events, that experience kind of led to my current job and to my working with offenders for the last 25 years or so. But that's really how I entered into that work, was I wanted to learn about grooming. I wanted to learn about the tricks that offenders would use that would make children more vulnerable. Now, one of the most important things that I will say at the beginning, and I'll say peppered throughout, and I'll say again at the end, a lot of what I'm talking about, especially in the very beginning, is behavior that could be grooming, or it's behavior that could be just someone being nice, right? There's not always an ulterior motive for somebody being nice. Some of these behaviors you might have engaged in, some of these behaviors other people you know might have engaged in. A lot of these behaviors are, in the very beginning, are behaviors that we want loving, caring, supporting adults to engage in, right? Because they're about being helpful and reaching out to children, etc. So I really want to warn you against kind of seeing some of these and automatically, viewing everything anybody does as grooming, or seeing it all through negative lenses. But it's important to have it be on your radar, so that if something does happen, or if you begin to see a pattern, or if you begin to see it move into some of what we'll talk about kind of midway through, that you're paying attention to that a little bit differently. So we don't want to overreact, but we don't want to underreact. We got to find that sweet spot in there. Let's see. So when we talk about grooming, what grooming is grooming is a series of steps that an offender will take in order to identify a victim, target a victim, begin to navigate into that victim's life, and then slowly reduce the barriers and manipulate that child and people around them to make that child easier to offend against, to make sex and sexuality, sex between adults and children, sexual contact, to make all of that seem normal, right? There's a process that you have to go through, because if an adult typically just starts out with some of the later forms of sexual abuse, that's going to raise red flags. It's going to raise red flags for parents. It's going to raise red flags for kids. Some offenders do go right to force. It's the minority, but some do. But most of them are going to groom. And the good news about that is grooming takes time. And the longer it takes for the grooming to happen, the more opportunities there are to intervene. The more opportunities there are for the child to say something, the more opportunities there are for you to notice something. So the fact that grooming happens gives us the ability to protect our children, because it gives us more time to recognize that something isn't right with this relationship. Okay. So the purpose of grooming, the reason that offenders use grooming, and you will hear me throughout this talk use the pronoun he most often. That's because most offenders are men. Not all offenders are men. If we were to take all the known sex offenders, about 10 to 20% would be women. Women tend to be treated a little bit different in the criminal justice world when it relates to sexual offending, as we'll talk about a little bit later. So we don't often hear as much about them, but certainly they are there. So if you hear me use the pronoun he most often, it's just because I'm playing a numbers game, and most often it's males, but it's certainly not just males. So the purpose of grooming is to be able to manipulate the child, manipulate people around the child, and reduce the likelihood that the child is going to tell, and reduce the likelihood that the child is going to be believed if they do tell. So in order to do that last part, they don't have to just groom the child. They have to groom everybody around the child. They have to groom the community. A lot of times individuals who have been, molesting children maybe for years, everybody is shocked and surprised. They're the pillar of community. They're this upstanding citizen that donates all of this time. Neighbors are shocked. That's because part of the grooming process is also grooming the community, grooming their own spouse, grooming the child's parents, grooming other people in their life. And in the very beginning, a lot of what we look at as grooming is really hard to distinguish between very appropriate adult-child interactions. So in the very beginning, it's really hard to be able to tell if that behavior is grooming or if that behavior is just, somebody being nice. That's why it's used so often, because the offender, if he's caught, can then fall back on the fact that I was just being nice, right? He can fall back on the fact that, somebody misunderstood what I was doing or whatever, and that can easily be believed because the behavior is fairly normal and typical. So one of the things that I think is important is sometimes when we think of sex offenders, we think of strangers lurking in the dark, and certainly there are some offenders who are kind of blitz attackists, who sneak into the home or sneak into your lives in that way and abuse or abduct. But that's rare. It's as rare as it is tragic. About 90% of the time, if a child is abused, it's by somebody they know, probably by somebody that they trust. And the younger the child is, the more likely it's a family member, right? So, a family reunion might be more dangerous to run into somebody who might harm your child than them going off alone to the park. So we have to, make sure that we are not putting ourselves in a false sense of security by thinking that it's only strangers that we have to watch out for. I remember when noticing, like as my children were growing up, when they were a baby, I could control almost everybody that came into their world, right? There's very, very few people that could hold or touch my child that didn't have my permission. And then as my child got older, my circle of influence around that got smaller, right? And I might know their teacher, and I might know their librarian, and I might know the bus driver, but I might not know the substitute teacher in the next classroom, right? And so the amount of people that are in our children's lives that we don't know, but they know, increases as they get older. And so to pay attention to who is in our child's life, to know the names of the adults that they are around often, and to make a point of, even just, spending a little bit of extra time talking to that karate coach after practice or something, letting them know that you are an involved parent in those simple ways can help decrease the likelihood that your child will be targeted. Because if they can identify that you have a close relationship with your child, that makes your child less of a target. Now, everything that I say, there's exceptions to, and individuals who have, very close, loving relationships with very, very involved parents, certainly their children are at risk of being abused as well. But one of the things that the offender will rely on is the fact that it's embarrassing for children to talk about the fact that they've been touched. There's a lot of shame and embarrassment involved in that. And if that child has minimal adults in their life, they have very few people in their life that they can talk to, then that decreases the likelihood that that child's going to tell. And that makes that child more attractive to a potential abuser. So the first stage in grooming, I kind of divide grooming into 5 different parts. And the first stage is targeting the victim. So at this stage, This is where the offender is going to place themselves in a job or a volunteer activity that allows him easy access to children, especially children who might be experiencing problems of some sort. This is where the individual is going to create an environment where they have ready access to kids. The gentleman in this picture is Dr. Larry Nasser. If you haven't seen the Netflix documentary, Athlete A, please take a moment and write that down. It's binge worthy. And it talks about the abuse that took place within USA Gymnastics when he was the volunteer doctor. And it does a nice job of showing grooming, because they talked about how a lot of the adults in their life at that time, their coaches were really hard on them, and you know, everybody was really pressuring them and stuff. And this was the nice doctor, and he would sneak them candy, and he would make sure that, you know, they felt special. Meanwhile, he was abusing them. And so they had really mixed emotions about this, because here is somebody that they really liked and they really trusted, who set himself up as being the good guy, but was also the person that was abusing them. And so this is where, you know, you hear stories about the youth worker, you hear stories about, you know, the teacher, the baseball coach, you know, all the people who are in positions that give them ready access to children. And some offenders will choose simply on access, especially if this is somebody who maybe doesn't have a job or a position that gives them access to a lot of children. Then it might just be opportunistic. This kid moved in the apartment across the hall, and, you know, I work at the post office or somewhere where I don't have access to a whole bunch of kids, but I got this kid across the hall. And maybe that's not the age group they're really interested in, and might not even be the gender they're really interested in, but it's who's available. And so sometimes it's based just on opportunistic. Other times, you know, you might have somebody who has what we call a target victim range. And a target victim range is somebody who, you know, typically molests boys between 12 and 14, or girls between 8 and 9. It doesn't mean they don't go outside of that, but that's really their preference, and that's where most of their victims are going to be. When they have victims outside of that range, it's probably something like the older brother or younger sister of somebody that they've already been abusing. And they might also have a particular type, just like adults can have a type of who we're attracted to, of gender, ethnicity, body type, etc. Offenders who are most attracted to younger kids before age 8 or so, are more likely to cross gender lines. So if he abuses little 6-year-old girls, he's more likely to abuse little 6-year-old boys than he is if he abuses 14-year-old girls to abuse 14-year-old boys, right? Because little kids' bodies are more similar, and they're more likely to be able to cross those lines and abuse both genders, or two of the many genders, however you want to put that, if they are interested in younger children. Once they've targeted that child, then they're going to look for vulnerability. They will be more likely to ideally want to seek out a child who's lonely, a child who has experienced loss, a child who has experienced trauma, a child who has low self-confidence, perhaps because, you know, somebody has convinced that child that, you know, you're no good. Maybe they've come from an abusive home and they've internalized that. Children who are shy, children who are quiet, children who are loners are more often to be targeted. When I talk about, you know, which children are more likely to be targeted, you know, I want to just be very clear. Please don't hear me say anything about that is that child's fault, or anything about that says that children who don't have those characteristics cannot be abused, because neither of those things are true. But if we're looking for how does this typically happen, what are some of the things to look for if we're going to look for what's going to be most often, if you are a foster care parent and you have 2 children and one of them is very loud and very outgoing and very competent and very assertive and very willing to speak their own mind and advocate for themselves and say no to adults in all sorts of ways. And then if you have another foster child who's very quiet, very lonely, doesn't have a lot of friends, doesn't feel very good about themselves, came from an abusive home, you are more likely to find that second child targeted by a perpetrator than you are the first child, right? Because the second child looks less likely to tell and more easy to manipulate based on their past history of trauma. Also, children who have less parental oversight, you know, kids that have their own key to the apartment or their house and they come home after work and maybe they've got several hours by themselves, and this is well known to other people in the child's life, that can make them more of a target. Kids who come from single parent families can be more of a target. Just that goes with less parental oversight, feeling overwhelmed, more opportunity to step in and be the good guy by offering to help. And again, children who don't have a lot of adults in their lives. Like I mentioned before, telling an adult that you have been abused is embarrassing. It's difficult for children to have these conversations, and so the fewer adults they have in their lives, the less likely it is that they have somebody that they're going to be able to tell. So children who are living in foster care, shelters, children who've been exposed to poverty, domestic violence, drugs, children with a troubled past, children who have been abused before, are all much more likely to be targeted. Offenders will also target children with a history of lying. So if there's a child who, you know, it gets in trouble all the time for maybe lying or stealing or doing different things, that becomes a very attractive target to an offender. Imagine a situation where you've got somebody who is, you know, very well respected in the community and very well liked, and nobody's ever made any allegations before. And then you've got this troubled kid who's been in trouble a lot and who's been caught lying and been caught stealing. And here's this nice adult that comes in and tries to mentor this child. And a couple months later, that child came out and says, he touched me, right? There are going to be some individuals who are going to say, oh my God, here's Bobby, he's always lying. You know, here he is lying again. He's got somebody who's being, you know, nice and trying to help him, and he's just got to sabotage that. So sometimes Bobby might have been chosen just for that reason, because if he does tell, he's less likely to be believed. Okay, so we're going to go through common behaviors at each step. But in general, what you're looking for in the beginning are going to be an adult that just seems a little overly interested in this child. You might have an adult couple that you're friends with, and they come over and you guys barbecue or you play cards, you sit on the porch and have a couple drinks. And they might talk with your kids when they come over, and they might remember their name or remember that they're into sports, and they might have these, you know, talks in the beginning and the end as they're coming and going. But you might also have that adult who leaves the barbecue, and you find them up in your child's room and they're talking to your child about that. Or you find out a couple weeks later they've got your child's phone number and they're texting about how things are going, right? So there's a difference between an adult who's being friendly and having these conversations and an adult who really seems overly interested in the child, to an extent that is not the same as other adults in your life have been interested in that child. They seem to show more interest in building a relationship with the child than with the adult. They might display age and gender preferences. You might notice that it always seems to be with, you know, 12-year-old girls. And there's just something about it that seems overly fixated, something that just causes your radar to go up. Oftentimes they'll single out one child as special and give that child extra attention, gifts, ways to kind of form a bond between the two of them. They might take special interest in the child's look or dress. It's not uncommon for individuals who are grooming a child in the early stages to be really interested in whether that child has a boyfriend or a girlfriend, and to ask them a lot of questions about boyfriends or girlfriends or kissing or that kind of stuff, even in front of the parents. The more they do in front of the parents, the more they legitimize what they're doing. So if they give that child a hug in front of you and you don't look like it's a problem, right? And it may not be a problem, but that child is now seeing, oh, okay, I guess this isn't a problem. And they will use that to their advantage. They will use the fact that much of their behavior is very normal, much of their behavior is very typical, in order to allow that to move on to what's not normal and what's not typical. And you'll be surprised how many places, you know, in our culture begin to legitimize grooming behavior or the sexualization of children. Please take a moment and write down, you know, Ted Nugent's song Jailbait, and Google the lyrics to that as he sings about a 13-year-old girl. Or the old song by Gary Puckett, Young Girl, and what he's talking about, how, ooh, it's too bad I found out how young you are. I don't know, maybe I still can't control myself. Or Love's Baby Soft perfume because innocence is sexier than you think, and it shows a young girl with makeup. There are ways in which our society sexualizes children, and the offender will use that to their advantage in trying to normalize this as well. Another thing to watch for, you know, if your 14-year-old son has a lot of really good looking, or one or two good looking 19-year-old women with, you know, bathing suit pictures and stuff that they're friends with, you might want to know if they know that person in real life or just online, because that may turn out to be a 41-year-old man, right? And sometimes what will happen is they will pose as somebody that the child might be interested in. They will send images off the internet. They will ask the child to send them images, send me a picture of you masturbating. And then after they've done that, they you know, might say, look, I recorded that, and I want you to send me more pictures, or I'm going to send that to your dad. I'm going to let your dad know what you did. And the term for that is sextortion. And they've, you know, some studies have shown up to 5% of kids have been victims of that, where they have either willingly sent pictures, or they have been kind of catfished, and they've sent pictures to somebody that they thought was, you know, either somebody who was their age or somebody who was the picture that they said they were, and they weren't. So we want to look for that with our kids' social media. So the favorite uncle, this is Uncle Buck here in this picture, the favorite uncle who always makes time to talk to the kids at Thanksgiving. He remembers what they're interested in. He knows what music they like. He knows, you know, that they're in baseball, or that they applied to this college or whatever, and he makes them feel special. You know, that uncle's probably just a good guy, right? That all falls in the realm of stuff that can look like grooming, but is also very normal. But then there's the uncle who really seems to spend much more time with the kids and the adults. He always goes to the basement alone with them. He never brings a romantic partner to family events. He has the cell phone numbers of kids. He texts them often during the week. He gives them special presents when it's not a holiday, and he tells them not to tell your mom or dad. He's always asking if they have a boyfriend or girlfriend. He's always asking about their sex life. He's very huggy with him, and the kids don't seem to want that hug. Like, you can see that they're kind of moving away or pushing away. He plays tickle games with the girls and wrestles with the boys, and he's always wanting to take them camping on the weekends. you might just want to be monitoring that relationship a little bit closer, because there's a lot of things in there that look like, you know, potential grooming behavior. Also, one thing I didn't say, he's got a lot of toys in his house, but he doesn't have kids. You start getting a lot of these, you know, piling up, and it's just something that you're, you might want to lean in a little bit closer and monitor that. So once they've identified that victim, the next step is going to be gaining the victim's trust, right? As we said before, most victims are molested by someone they know, someone in their family, someone in their school, their community, their church, their sporting events. They are going to work to gain the trust of the child and gain the trust of other adults. And then they're going to also get more information about that child that they can use, and more information about the family to find out how to make themselves indispensable to that family. Like, how do I find a way where I can get closer into this family? So at this stage, again, things look very normal. We can't really distinguish it between adults who are just good, kind, helpful adults. They're not asking anything of the child. They're making the child feel special. They're finding out what the kid likes, what music do they like, video games, TV shows. And they are letting the kid know that they have a lot in common with them, right? If the child's parents are separated, the offender, you know what, my parents are separated. If the child is bullied in school, you know what, the offender will say, I was bullied when I was your age. If the child is feeling depressed, then the offender will talk about how, yeah, I know what that's like. You know, I was depressed when I was your age, and I still struggle with that. It's easier to trust people that are more similar to us, and he's going to try and make it seem like he understands that child in a way that other adults don't. Because not only does he want to get closer into the family, but he's going to try to draw a wedge between that child and potential helpers, between that child and other people who might be able to intervene. Right? So, you know, sometimes that offender is that creepy guy who lives in the blue house by the park and all the moms, you know, warn the kids about. But other times he's the most loved teacher, basketball coach who volunteers on the weekend to help disabled kids, the nice person in your life. And offenders can often be seen pressing these boundaries because so much of it looks normal and breaking rules, but they're rarely caught in the act of actually abusing a child, right? So you're much more likely to see these boundary violations and much more likely to be able to intervene. And if you're worried about intervening in a way that makes the other person feel bad, like, you know, you don't want to say something to this guy that you know, was just being nice, and he was helping out, and he was offering to pick your kid up from basketball practice because your car's in the shop, and you don't want to, you know, make them feel like you think they're a pervert, you can talk about it in the ways of family rules, right? I really appreciate that. You know, one of the rules that we have is nobody will pick up the child if it's not mom or dad. So this is just a family rule that we have, right? It's not about them. It's about you and the rules and the boundaries that you have set. Okay. So the next thing that will happen is they'll look to fill a need. So this is Mary Kay Letourneau. Mary Kay Letourneau taught a young boy in kindergarten and then began a sexual affair with him when he was a sixth grader. She actually had 2 children with him, went on to marry him. And it was very interesting how the media treated her. Mary Kay Letourneau was attractive, upper class, white, female. She came from a place of privilege in multiple ways, and because of that, you know, she was on, I think, like Oprah and different things, and they talked about it being like a love story. You know, if she were a male minority bus driver who had abused a young girl, nobody would have talked about it as being a love story. And so because she came from a place of privilege, she was able to get by with offending. Legally, she was sanctioned, but there was just a very different feel for that relationship among people. And what that does then then is that sends a message to the young boys who are abused by adult women that maybe they're not really victims, right? Because they're not necessarily treated like they're victims. Young girls who are abused by older men are treated as victims. Young boys who are treated or who are abused by older women, you know, you'll hear comments about how they got lucky, right? Look at how attractive that teacher was. I wish my teacher had done something like that. And that really invalidates for that child the fact that they have been abused, and it makes it harder for them to understand the makings of abuse and harder to report if something happens the next time. Okay, so they're going to work to fill a need. So what they might say to the child, you know, is something like, hey, you're going to camp next week? Great. You know, you have to pass a swim test to go out to the floating dock. I used to be a swim instructor. I could teach you. You know, you don't want to have to hang out in the shallow end with all the little kids. And tell the parent, you know, you don't have to pay $100 for swimming lessons. I'm a good swimmer. I would be happy to take them. Right? So they're going to find ways to fill a need. You can see why children from like single parent families are especially targeted, because, you know, hey, I'll watch the child while you go grocery shopping, or let me do some babysitting while you do this, or I'll pick up the kids if you're late from work, right? So they can try to identify, where can I get myself closer to this child? Where can I fit into this family? So, you know, an adult that's giving special privileges on a regular occasion, they frequently initiate or create opportunities to be alone with your child, and to be alone when you're not there. They might show favoritism toward one child within a family, seem overly interested in spending time with that child, always want to be around that child. And it seems that they're more interested in building a relationship with your child than with you, right? And what they're going to do for the kid at this stage is that they're really going to make that child feel special. They're going to give them gifts. They're going to give them special privileges. They're going to ask them to keep non-sexual secrets, right? I will let you stay up late and I won't make you eat dinner, but don't tell your mom, right? Well, what he's doing is he's checking to see, is the child going to keep a secret? Because if the child doesn't keep a secret and he tells, and the offender is caught, you know, letting the child stay up past bedtime, well, that's not illegal, and that's pretty easy to explain away. And the offender has just learned a valuable lesson. This child won't keep secrets, right? So if they're keeping a list of possible kids to offend against, that child gets crossed off. Right? So they're going to start with these little things and see if the child does keep that secret. And then they go on to the next list, right? This is a child who will keep a secret. And then maybe they make the secrets bigger and bigger until the secrets become sexual secrets, right? And what they're going to do is kind of find ways where the relationship between the child and the offender gets strengthened, and potentially the relationship between the child and other helpers gets weakened, right? So they're going to talk about the fact that they love spending time with this child. I don't know why your mom doesn't spend more time with you. Something that's going to kind of subtly create that impression that the offender is more interested in the child than their parents are. One offender, you know, I've evaluated probably over 1,000 sex offenders by now. You know, and I always ask them what grooming tricks they use and what kinds of things that they tried. And one of them told me, if you see a group of girls, like at the mall or something, you walk up to them and you compliment the least attractive one in the group, and she's yours. Right? I have never forgot that quote. There are days I don't remember where I parked. There's days I don't remember how much my kids weighed at birth, right? But I have never forgot that quote. That just speaks to kind of the level of manipulation and predation and the way that some of these folks can go about trying to get that weak link. Okay. This is Jerry Sandusky, who volunteered as an assistant football coach at a high school and formed a charity to help disadvantaged youth and molested young boys for years, possibly decades. So here's what the kid is going to hear. You know, I remember what it was like to be your age, never have enough money to buy anything. Here's 10 bucks to get yourself some candy. Don't tell your mom, she might get mad, right? There's a non-sexual secret where I'm just testing the water. And there's other ways here, like the second one, you know, at this one, you can see that what he's doing is he's beginning to put in kind of some sexual questions, not much, but he's saying stuff like, I bet those girls are just jealous, you're prettier, and I bet they haven't even kissed a boy yet, right? So he's gonna talk about being sexually experienced, and eventually then this is a way where she can practice being more sexually experienced. Okay, so again, it might be, things you might look for at this time is that your kids have things that they can't explain where they got. You know, where did you get that cell phone? Or I didn't buy you those sneakers, you know, and, you know, they're always saying they borrowed them from a friend or this or that, or they're being vague about how they got them. But jewelry, gifts, money, things are showing up that you are pretty sure that they didn't get from you or from anybody that they had permission to get. The child might also be getting much more secretive about how they're spending their time, especially their time online. And you're just beginning to notice maybe that there's some differences in that relationship that up till now didn't get on your radar. But now you're starting to see a few things that are beginning to make you question this. Okay. So what you're going to see, the offender is going to become very useful to the family, right? They're going to find a way to fill a need. They're going to find a way to make themselves indispensable. They're going to find a way to give an excuse to be around that child more. Okay. So the next stage is they need to get the child alone. If they're going to abuse that child, they have to get them alone. So this is where the things that they offer to do are going to be more and more alone time, right? Babysitting, like I said, or, you know, they'll come up with things like, this is the football coach who monitors the showers because the older boys bully the younger boys in there. Something about it doesn't feel right to everybody, but it makes sense, right? Like, okay, I get that. I don't want my, you know, little kid bullied by the big kid, so it doesn't feel right, but the explanation makes enough sense that maybe we don't say anything about it. The camp counselor who checks the kid for tics, right? The music teacher who thinks the child has a real gift, they just need more and more private lessons. Things that begin to, you know, create more and more time alone, and especially sleepovers. Right? Wanting to take the kid camping, wanting to take the kid on a sleepover, and finding ways to ask to do that during a time where it's clear that the other adult, you know, the parent isn't going to be part of that. Okay. They might then, as they've got the child alone, you know, start to begin to build the relationship with the kid and to slowly kind of push the relationship with the parents out. No one really understands the child the way they do, right? You know, you are, you know, very special and brilliant and gifted and all of these things. You know, I don't know why your mom's always picking on you that you got to clean up your room, right? Like, you know, if you were my kid, that would never be an issue, those kinds of things. So next, and here we have Jared from Subway and Paul Rubens, Pee Wee Herman, both individuals who were caught with child sexual abuse images on their computers. This is where isolating the child happens, and what they're going to hear again are all of these kinds of things that make the child feel special and create that relationship. How do you spot this? They want to be alone with your child. They have contact with your children a lot when you're not present. They're extremely interested in your child's romantic life. They ask a lot of questions about boyfriends and sexual experiences. They seem to always prefer to be in the company of children. They share secrets with your child and ask your child to keep secrets. They ignore your boundaries. You've set certain boundaries and you've noticed that they've crossed them. You want to see, things that you might want to do is you might want to drop in unexpectedly. You might want to stay for the whole practice. You might just want to sort of randomly be there so that they know that they're never going to have extended periods of time alone with your child, to decrease the likelihood that something might happen and to increase that monitoring that you're going to do. So I'll give you a little bit of a personal story here, and then we'll probably take a break for some questions. But when my son was about 7 years old, he wanted to have his birthday party at a bowling alley. And I don't know why, my husband and I don't bowl, and we've never taken him bowling at that point, but he saw something on TV, he wanted to go bowling. So he had his birthday party at the small little bowling alley. And while we were there, it was my husband and I and my daughter, and then all the kids. And, I kept being distracted by this guy who was, an older guy and was a little intoxicated. And he was just really kind of spending a lot of time with these three boys. And I couldn't connect those three boys to any other parent. They seemed to be there by themselves. I'm watching this for a while, and it's kind of making my radar go up, but I haven't really, done anything. And then I see him take these boys down this hallway. And they're standing down this hallway, and they're just talking. But again, there's something about it doesn't seem right to me. And so I walk down the hallway, and I pick up my cell phone, and I'm not talking to anybody, but there's a woman at the time, her name was Barb Breland, and she was the head of parole and probation, and she worked with all of the people that supervise sex offenders. So if you were a sex offender in Fargo, you knew that name, right? And so I just walked down the hallway and just said, yeah, could I speak with Bart Breland, please? Just to see if I got a reaction, to see if that name meant anything to him. And it didn't. And so, okay, passed that test. But still, I didn't like it. And the next thing I saw was he put his hand on one of the boys' legs. They were sitting down in the hallway by this time. And he said, let's go, I'm going to go buy you a pizza. And I said, no. And then I realized I said that out loud, right? Because it kind of just came out of my mouth. But he kind of looks at me, and the boys look at me, and I said to the boys, do your parents know that you're here? And he said no. And I said, well, maybe you should ask your parents if it's okay, to be here and to have this gentleman, buy you a pizza. Now, this could have been a guy who has grandchildren who live in Colorado, and he hasn't seen them for a long time, and he really misses them, right? This could have been a guy who there was nothing wrong about what he was doing. But I didn't like that it had to be down a hallway. I didn't like that it had to be secretive. I didn't like that he's touching these kids that he clearly didn't know. And so then he leaves, and then the kids are looking at me, and I'm like, well, I'm in this now, and so I just said something like, most adults are good, and most adults are kind, and most adults do not hurt children, right? But if somebody touches you and they don't have permission to do that, or if somebody makes you feel uncomfortable or is spending, time with you that doesn't feel right, you might want to ask yourself what that's about. And you might want to have a conversation with your mom and dad about what happened. And I thought afterwards, it was interesting that it raised my radar, but what really was interesting is my daughter, who was 13 at the time, was noticing the same thing. And it didn't feel right to her either. And she went to my husband and said, I don't think he knows those kids. Something's not right about that. And my husband had also noticed it, and there was something about it that didn't feel right to him, and he had gone to the bartender. and said, hey, who is this guy who's got these kids down here, right? So three of us kind of noticed something about that wasn't right, and we all took a different way to kind of approach that. But that seemed to me like an example of grooming. And if he was just a really nice guy who missed his grandkids, well, the worst thing that happened is, you know, he's going to have to go home and Skype with them instead of talking with these kids. But it probably taught a pretty important lesson to both of them, and also about the fact that, you know, there may be other people watching, right? So we're going to go to stage 5, which is really the most important stage here on some of the boundary things. But I'm noticing that about an hour has gone by. And so I'm going to stop here and see if anybody has any questions. And then I'm going to be sure that by at least a quarter after, I get back into this so that I can make sure that we get to the boundary part, because this is a really important piece. So Amy, do we have any questions coming in so far?
So what I've seen in the chat box thus far is basically a lot of like aha moments, like people saying, oh gosh, yeah, wow, type of thing, privately to me. And then there were a couple of questions. You had mentioned a Netflix series. I believe you said Athlete A. Is that right? So a couple of people wanted clarification on that, but I don't know. I'm not seeing any other questions yet come in. I don't know if anyone wants to quick type something up, but I'm not seeing any questions yet at this point. So.
Okay, then I'll move into the testing boundaries piece. And then if there's more questions after that, we can take some time. So at this point now, you know, he's identified the child, he's targeted the child, he's isolated the child, he has found a way into that child's life, and he has seen if that child is going to keep non-sexual secrets. Now is the time where we're really separating, right, from anything that would be normal. Now we've got somebody who's now going to start testing limits related to sex and sexual activity. So it's going to start with a simple hug that lasts maybe a little bit too long. The hug is probably, that first hug is even going to be in front of you because that legitimizes it, right? It's going to serve the purpose of slowly minimizing the child's resistance to sexual touch, right? Might be that he comes up behind that kid when they're doing their homework and gives them a little massage, right? Or they're showing him how to swing the bat and he's, you know, holding just a little bit tighter. Or they're wrestling and he accidentally touches, you know, the girl's breasts, or he accidentally, you know, touches them in their private parts. And then he might even apologize, like right away. What does the kid do? How does the kid react? Does the kid tell? All of this is part of the testing process to see, can I take it a step further, right? It's going to be any kind of like touch or maybe language. You might start telling dirty jokes. You might start using language that's not appropriate in your house. You know, I had one guy who was babysitting a child, and what he did is the child always watched a certain video, like I don't remember what it was, we'll say Lion King, always watched the Lion King after he woke up from his nap. Well, the kid kind of knew how to work the VCR, and then it was always Lion King was always the movie that was in there, and so it was just, the kid kind of did it on his own. And one day, the kid went and pushed play, and it was pornography. And the offender watched to see what the kid did and whether or not the kid said anything, and then apologized. Oh, I'm very sorry, and had an excuse. Like if the child would have told, he would have been, I'm so sorry, I'm mortified, I can't believe that happened, it'll never happen again. So if the child tells, he's still got an out, right? He can still try to make an excuse for that. And if the child doesn't tell, well, then he's going to capitalize on some of that natural curiosity, and he's going to see if he can try something else, and he's going to see if he can go a little bit further in that. Tickles are a big one, and wrestling, and that will happen. Or again, off-color jokes, truth or dare, strip poker, One of the things that offenders will do is they will find a way to ask the child to touch them first. Like, have you ever seen, have you ever seen a penis before? Would you like to touch it? And then if the child does, then later when the child begins to be uncomfortable with what's happening, the offender will say, you touched me first, right? And he'll say, if anybody asks, they're going to find out that you touched me first. And that's to confuse the child and make the child think it was their idea, when of course it wasn't. So that's a trick that they'll use. Or again, a lot of accidents that will happen. They might encourage the child to go skinny dipping. They might try to find ways to be alone with that child that will naturally result in, one or both of them being, undressed at some point. Like, we'll go swimming, or, we'll go, camping or whatever, where, they're going to be time alone, and they're going to have to change clothes and all of that kind of stuff. So they'll try to get themselves in these kinds of situations, and they'll just move it up a little bit, right? Not a huge bit at a time, but just seeing what they can get away with. They might discuss sexual matters under the guise of offering education, right? Like, this is how we teach kids. Kids need to learn about sex by somebody who loves them. And the tests are often tied to rewards or punishers, and they might not even be overt. So they might never say anything about it, but all the girls on the volleyball team know that the coach gets handsy, and the girls that complain about it sit on the bench. But the ones that don't get a lot more playing time, right? Or that, this teacher's looking down your shirt, or, trying to grab you as you walk by and make it seem like an accident. But you'll get an A on your essay instead of a B. Right? And so they notice that they're tied to these sorts of things. You'll see in that Netflix documentary, Athlete A, the one athlete that spoke up and told, all of a sudden, for reasons that don't seem coincidental, she didn't end up making the Olympic team. Right? Even though her numbers were higher than some of the girls who did. So there can be big punishers and big rewards that end up happening for engaging in this behavior. And keep in mind, by this time, the offender has worked hard to be an important person in that child's life. Right? This isn't, at this time when we're talking about grooming, this isn't a stranger that comes up to this girl in the parking lot and grabs her breast, right? This is somebody that she has grown to really care about, that she notices that her mom really depends on, that she probably really likes because he makes her feel special. And now it's really confusing. Like, what do I do with this now? And do I tell? And what does that mean? And, what does that mean for my family? And if I tell, then he can't come over anymore, and my kids can't be, or my brothers and sisters can't be in these sports. It's really confusing for the kids at this age, because he has tried really hard to be the good guy, and to try to make sense of how the good guy could do this makes it harder for kids to be able to complain. The best documentary I've ever seen that shows grooming, regardless of what your beliefs are with Michael Jackson, he was never convicted, but Leaving Neverland is binge-worthy, and I think it's on Netflix, but it really shows grooming. It really shows those kids talking about how it was that they felt they were in a relationship with him. They felt they were dating him. They felt special when he, would be sexual with them, and they felt jealous when they saw a new boy that was now getting that attention. It does a really nice job of showing how offenders can create this world that's so confusing for kids. And it's a way that really discourages them from reporting. So again, Sometimes at this point, they'll resort to force or threats because they've invested a lot of time and grooming didn't work. And some of them will take it to the next level by forcing the child. Sometimes they'll back off and realize that they've got to do a little bit more grooming in order to go forward, right? And so they're just kind of seeing how much can I get away with. If they start to get some backlash, they move back a little bit and then try it again. So the questions become more sexual. The introduction to pornography happens, letting them know how introducing them to masturbation, needing their special hugs to feel better. The last one, you finally got a date with Bobby. That's great. I bet he's going to want a blowjob. You know how to give him, right? He's going to think you're really inexperienced if you don't know how, right? So playing on that insecurity and offering, hey, this isn't about me, right? This is about me helping you, right? That's how he's going to try to make this come across. So what do you notice here? They're overly touchy with your child. They tease your child about breast and genital development. They'll snap her bra, or they'll make some kind of comment about early breast development. That's not a normal comment for men to make to young girls. And so that should really raise a red flag when he's teasing her about, starting to develop or not starting to develop. Another thing that they can do is they can accidentally walk in on the child or accidentally have the child walk in on them. They leave the door open when they're going to the bathroom. They walk from the bathroom to the bedroom without wearing a towel and the kids see them. If that's a real accident, they're going to cover up. They're going to apologize profusely. They're going to tell the child it wasn't their fault. They're going to tell the adult who is responsible for that child that this happened. They're not going to try to keep that a secret. They're not going to try to blame the child, and it's not going to happen again and again and again. If there was a real accident, the adult is going to feel horrified, and they're going to take great pains to make sure that that never happens again. So again, planning activities that require removing clothing, bath time. Somebody offers to babysit your child, and you come home and you notice that they gave your kids a bath. You didn't tell them that they had to give your kids a bath. Well, we got really messy because we were playing with whatever, something. That should be interesting and something that you should pay attention to and ask some more questions. They tell your child dirty jokes. They're taking pictures of your child. They're talking about more sexual information. And for those of you who were here before, I told my Uncle Ken story. This is a great opportunity for us to teach sovereignty over our own bodies to children. So I'll make it short because I think most of you were there last time. But for those that weren't, I told the story about how my Uncle Ken went in to hug my daughter when she was young, which was a very normal part of our family. That was not something that raised any red flags for anybody. But Uncle Ken's a big guy. He's like, I don't know, 6'6" and over 200 pounds. And she was scared. And so she kind of backed off. And my mom said, oh, give Uncle Ken a hug. You're hurting his feelings, right? And so, and I jumped in, of course, and said, absolutely not. And Uncle Ken, bless his heart, got down on his, crouched down and said, would you shake my hand? And showed my daughter that she has a right to decide who touches her and who doesn't. But that's a really important, moment. Like if you're a real huggy family and the child doesn't want somebody to hug them, then they should be validated in the fact that they have control over who touches their body. And they don't even have to have a reason why. I don't care why she didn't want Uncle Ken to hug her. She didn't want Uncle Ken to hug her, right? And the next Thanksgiving she did, so all was good. But she has a right to say no. Your children have a right to say no. And so we want to make sure that they know that they do that. We send mixed messages to our kids, right? We tell our kids, don't talk to strangers. And then we're in line at Hornbacher's and the woman, who's getting our groceries says, oh, what a pretty little girl. What's your name? And your daughter doesn't answer. And then you kind of knock her a little bit and you say, don't be rude. And she looks at you like she's a stranger. You told me not to talk to strangers, right? Like sometimes we give really confusing messages to children, and we want to watch that and be careful about that. And one of the most important ones that we don't want to give is that adults are always right? Like we want to teach our kids to be respectful, but we don't want to teach our kids that adults are always right, because there are times where some adults will take advantage of the fact that kids have been told that. And kids have a right to say who touches me, who hugs me, who gets this close into my body area. So the last stage is they're going to try to maintain control. So now that they have found a child, it takes a significant amount of time to groom a child, right? This process can take days if they don't have a lot of time. It can take months if they do. But they're not going to want to lose that, because they're not going to want to start over from scratch. So the secrecy, the blame, the emotional manipulation, and the threats, in order to maintain that continued participation, will start to increase. Because now that the child has crossed that boundary, they're going to work extra hard to make sure that that child thinks that any consequences that come to the offender also come to you, right? So it's not, you can't tell or I will go to jail. It's you can't tell or we will go to jail. You can't tell or your dad will be mad at me. It's you can't tell or your dad will be mad at us, right? And so they work to make sure that the child realizes what consequences will come to the child. They will trick the child into thinking that the child consented to this, that this was normal. They'll trick the child with things like, you touched me first. They'll trick the child with things like hugs and talks that happened in front of the parents, and making it seem like that means that parents will be okay with all of this. So they'll begin to be more manipulative at this point, and this is where the child goes from kind of feeling special often to now feeling trapped. And so what you might begin to see, or here's some of the things that the kids will hear. I know, many times I've heard of children that have put up with abuse because they didn't want the perpetrator to move on to their younger brothers or sisters. I have heard of children in foster care not telling about the abuse because this was their first good foster home and they didn't want to leave, right? We've moved from foster home to foster home to foster home, and finally we're in this home, and if I tell now about what's happening, I'm going to get uprooted and I'm going to move. So you hear children that will not tell because they're trying to protect younger siblings, or they're trying to protect other people, and because they have been tricked, because they've been told these lies in order to kind of hold them captive. Okay, so here you're going to start to notice things like your child seeming more depressed, your child seeming more anxious, more irritable, using drugs or alcohol maybe you'll see some self-harm. They don't want to be involved in certain activities like they used to. They seem nervous around certain adults that they used to really like, and they're just kind of more secretive in general, right? And this is time for those of you who've ever heard me speak before. I think this comes out in almost every talk I have, is please teach children the proper name for body parts. Not only is this important because it gives the children a voice and a way to explain what's happening to them, and a way to communicate with helpers what's happening, but we also don't want to send the message that body parts are something dirty or bad or something like that. Because when you think about it, as I wrote, no one says, you're being a penis to somebody, but they might say you're being a dick. And nobody says my ex-girlfriend was a vagina or a labia, but they might say my ex-girlfriend was the C word that I'm not going to use, right? And so when we use words for body parts that are put downs, then we also kind of send a message about what those body parts are and what that means. So I think we want to be really careful about that. We also want to listen carefully to sentences from our kids that start out like, would you be mad if, or I know somebody who, or I really don't want to go to that sleepover, or if I tell you something, will you promise not to be mad? You want to pay attention to these invitation openers, right? To where it sounds like there's something that the child wants to say, but they're testing the waters first, because the offender has worked really hard to try to make sure that child doesn't tell. They've worked really hard to try to make sure that the odds are stacked against that child in being believed. And when you look at what the research says about resiliency in children and abused children, and how children have lifelong sequelae from being abused, and how children go on to being survivors and thrivers and being able to overcome it, the number one predictor of how that child is going to get over that is, how did the very first person they told react, right? Were they believed? Were they loved? Were they protected? How did that first person react to that? So we want to be open to hearing these difficult conversations and knowing that being able to talk about this is overcoming many, many barriers that the offender has worked really hard to put in place to make it difficult for that child to tell. So I'm noticing again that we have just about 10 minutes left. I want to open it up to any other questions that we have, or anything anybody might want to know.
Yeah, we do have a number of questions that have come in, so we can certainly fill up our time here. So the first question that I have on our list is, do you believe that sexual offenders can actually change? This individual said that they've heard that they do not change.
Yeah, no, absolutely. If I didn't believe that, I wouldn't spend my career doing treatment with offenders, right? So now there's different types of offenders. There's individuals who are sexually interested in kids and only kids, like pedophilic individuals, and we're not going to change their interest. But that doesn't mean we can't change their behavior. And then there's a lot of folks who have molested a child not because of sexual interest in that child, but because of a wide variety of other factors: opportunity, revenge, etc. But the likelihood of an offender who has been caught, charged, and convicted of reoffending is actually quite low. It's the second lowest interpersonal crime reoffense rate, second only to murder. And the typical reoffense rate really is right around 10%. So when you hear that somebody is a high risk offender, it only takes about a 25% likelihood for somebody to be considered high risk, right? And when we hear high risk, we think that means 90%, 99%. But absolutely, offenders can change. Not every offender, of course, and just like not everybody can change other behaviors they have. But yes, I absolutely believe that they can. I believe treatment helps, and I've seen it, and so I think it's much more encouraging than we think it is. The key is consequences. Number one, very few people stop on their own, so consequences and treatment.
Well, you answered kind of two questions there, because another individual did ask the question of, kind of what is the percentage of reoffending, that sort of thing. So you kind of got two questions in one there. Next question would be, how much, if any, of this information should be shared with children to help protect themselves?
Sure. So I think it depends developmentally, right? There's certain conversations that we have with our 5-year-old that are different than we have with our 12-year-old. But from a very early age, I was, teaching my kids things about, especially whenever I saw a teachable moment, about who could hug them, who couldn't hug them, about who to watch out for. I have been proud of my daughter in many ways. She's a beautiful young woman, and she works with the developmentally disabled, and I kind of hit the jackpot, right? But I don't know if I've ever been prouder of her than I was when she was 8 years old. So I had told my daughter that I will never send somebody to pick you up. If somebody comes and says that I sent you to pick pick you up. It's a trick. That should never ever happen. And if you know, God forbid something happens and I have to do that, they will have the password. So we figured out what's the password going to be. The password was Sour Skittles. I feel comfortable saying that because she's 20 now. But I don't think she's going to fall for that if the password. But I was in Bismarck and I was testifying in court, and court kept running late, and I couldn't leave, and I'm 3 hours away, and I wasn't going to be able to pick up my daughter in time, and my husband was out of town, and I was, you know, petrified. And so I called my friend Christy, and I asked her to pick up my daughter. Now, Christy was as close to a sister as anybody in our life. We had spent time together. Our kids knew each other. We went to church together. I mean, this was a woman who was clearly part of our life. And when Christy went to pick up my daughter from Moana, my daughter asked what the password was, right? And so that conversation, you know, wasn't people are mean and out to get you, and there's perpetrators hiding behind every park bench. But it was, sometimes adults like to trick children. And these are some of the tricks. And this is how you will know this is or isn't a trick. And so I think it's very appropriate to teach kids what they need to be safe. Like, you know, we have gun safety class, and we teach our kids that they have to wear a seatbelt, and they have to drive the speed limit. And if that means that they have to know that if they don't wear a seatbelt and go the speed limit, and if they text while driving, they could get in a horrible accident and die, we still tell them that. And we tell them that because there's things they need to know to feel safe. We practice drills about what's going to happen if there's a fire. Where do you go? Right? That's a safety talk that we have with children. That's a pretty scary thing to think about, waking up in the middle of the night and there being a fire. But we have those conversations with our children. So if we have conversations with our children about those types of things, we should be able to have conversations with our children about these kinds of sexual dangers, which they're probably more likely to encounter than some of the other things that we do talk to them about.
Right. So the next question feeds right into that says, okay, so I have a kiddo that just kind of lives in their survival brain. Any tips on kind of how I encourage them to be safe and, you know, learn some of those pieces as well?
Sure. So when you have kids who, and when you say, you know, survival brain, I'm guessing that what you're talking about is this is somebody who, is anxious, who anticipates maybe danger being there, and is maybe not willing to engage and take risks. And please type in quick if I'm interpreting that wrong. And I'm going to pause and see if I'm corrected here on that. So when kids are anxious already, we want to be really careful about how we have conversations about things that can make them more anxious. But in many ways, I think you're at, like, as a parent, if I am overly scanning the environment for threats, if I am always thinking that I see a perpetrator, I'm always thinking that I see a threat, I'm actually less effective at finding real threats, right? Because I'm paying attention to everything. And I need to hone in on what's a real threat, right? And so I think we can talk to kids about, what sorts of things are real threats and what sorts of things feel like real threats, but maybe they're not. Right? And so we can talk about things like, what is the likelihood of something like that's going to happen? And how bad would it be if it did? Right? I'm really, really, really nervous that I'm going to, fail my English test. Well, what's the likelihood that you're going to fail your English test? Have you failed your English test before? Have you studied hard, etc.? And then how bad is it if you do? And so sometimes if we help kids go from, making everything kind of global and taking a smaller problem and making it into a bigger problem, they become easier to be able to deal with the problems when you can kind of, make them into something much more tangible than this kind of global anxiety about everything that's going to be there.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. It does. Okay, so the next question we have is, if you were sexually abused as a child, do your children or kiddos have a greater chance of that happening to them as well?
No, that's a great question. No, I've never seen anything that would suggest that. The only thing that I would say that could potentially impact that is if it was an incest offender and the offender is still in the home, right? So if it was grandpa, you know, if you were abused by your dad and kids are spending time with grandpa, right? Because that increases access. But no, there isn't anything that says that if you have been abused, that your children have a greater risk of that, right? What you have, you paid a dear price for the gift, but you have a gift of discernment now that other people don't have. And you might be better able to recognize these types of things for your children and to act as a protector for your child, which might decrease their likelihood actually of that, because you might just be more in tune to things that other people don't even notice.
Now, I know you've already kind of touched on the notion of techniques and kind of some ideas of how you would maybe talk to kiddos about this. But do you think that there's a specific age that you should start talking to them kind of about all of just kind of personal safety in this regard?
Not necessarily. I think you have conversations, different conversations at every age. Right? Like I still have conversations with my 14-year-old son and my 20-year-old daughter, but there are different conversations that I had with them when they were younger, right? So, you know, as I talked about in the other meeting, you know, I would take my son and would sit at West Acres and like, who would you go and ask for help and stuff. And so you talk about kind of opening the sphere of who are the helpers in the world and stuff. But like if mom was missing, how would you find somebody? But having different conversations at different times, I think are important. I've just, you know, I'll be reading a police report at night and I'll just knock on my daughter's door sometime, like when she was 13, and sometimes say stuff like, hey, just so you know, if you post a picture on Facebook, somebody can download an app and get the latitude and longitude and know exactly where that picture was taken. Just say it and walk out of the room, right? Like sometimes I have conversations that look like that. And so I think that if we're going to be protective of our children, we want to be able to have those conversations. And if they hear that we're okay talking about it, then they're much more likely to come to us with questions, right? Because if they know that you can have these awkward conversations and you can be awkward and it can, you know, you can stumble when you're saying it and all of that, and that's totally fine. These are difficult conversations. Don't feel like you have to, you know, be perfect and smooth and seamless when you have these. You just have to have them. And your kids have to know that you're okay hearing them. So I think these conversations can start, you know, as young as they're able to retain information. You know, we tell our kids not to put the, you know, finger in a light socket. And those are conversations we have at a very, very young age. I don't think you're too young to start having conversations about safety. That doesn't mean that we have to go into all the details we might go into when they're older.
Sure.
But it might be something as simple as talking about the difference between secrets and surprises, right? And secrets that make you feel good and secrets that make you feel bad. Right? And that's a really easy way to start having some of those conversations with kids who are really young, right? What secrets, you know, what secrets do people, you know, might have that make them feel icky? And what secrets do people have that are exciting? Like, you know, what mommy's getting for Christmas, that kind of stuff.
Great example. I'm guessing many households can utilize that one for sure. So you touched on the conversations we should be having within our own homes. But this person asked the question, okay, you gave the example of that, you know, individual behind you and your daughter at the grocery store or, you know, any of us at the grocery store is asking for that information. Do we confront that person? Do we say anything to that individual? Do we advocate in that moment at all to that individual?
You know, I think that varies. So, you know, it's hard to kind of give a hard and fast rule, because I think it's going to depend on exactly what happens and your comfort level and the child's comfort level. But I have gone from being as kind of simple and passive in that response by just, you know, grabbing my child and holding them closer, or having a conversation about, you know, we have family rules that that our kids can only accept gifts on birthdays and Christmas, and only if we know about it, you know, and having something be more simple, to having conversations that are much more direct about, I'm not accusing you of anything. I'm just saying I am really uncomfortable with the way this seems to be, you know, with what seems to be happening here. And so I'm not going to allow my daughter to go to X anymore. Right. So I think you can, whatever it's going to take in the immediate moment to remove you from that situation. And it might be something simple where you don't need to confront, and then you have a conversation with your child afterwards, to something that clearly sets the limit of, no, that's not okay.
So I do know we're at the 8:30 hour. You know, I guess I could maybe beg Dr. Benson for a few more moments of her time, because we do have a few more questions. But I do know some of you maybe have kind of formalized those plans, right, with additional caregivers in your home, or, you know, you've kind of maybe promised some of those older kids in your home that you'd be off at 8:30. So if you do have to go attend to the rest of life, you could go maybe and tune back in on the recording to hear this next portion. But we'll maybe try to sneak a few more minutes of Dr. Benson's time, because we do have a little bit or a few more questions that are actually really pertinent, I feel like. So one of the questions would be, could you touch on kind of how rare it is for kids to lie about being sexually abused?
Oh, great question. So I used to know the stats to this. I don't think I know them now. Give me just a second to see if I can give you like an actual number, because at some point I did know that. And I can't, and I don't want to get it wrong. I will say it's extremely rare. Now, there are, you know, one situation that I used to see a lot that I think a lot of people were skeptical about was, let's say that there's a divorce or a separation, and now all of a sudden this comes out, right? And sometimes people are really skeptical about that situation, and they think that maybe this is one parent, you know, trying to get back at the other parent or something. But another possibility of that is now the child feels safe. Right? So the child maybe didn't feel safe to say anything before. Now the person that was harming them is out of the home. Now the threats of different things that are going to happen, you know, they don't have to worry about that anymore. So they're more likely to tell. There are very few positive things that happen to somebody who reports sexual abuse. You know, that it's not a club that people want to join. There's very, very few positives that come from that. And so for somebody to go through the process of making a report is exceedingly rare if it didn't happen. Now, certainly there's exceptions to that. And there may be times where for one reason or another, a child or an adult makes a report that turns out not to be true. But that would be an extremely rare occurrence. And if you were going to play the odds would be in the favor that if the child makes the claim that they have been harmed, that they have likely been harmed.
Okay, you fed right into the next question and already answered it, in the sense of, do you think those who have offended were actually offended on themselves? So,
so that's interesting. Common thought is that offenders are offending because they were abused as kids, right? And being offended as a child makes you more likely to go on to offend as an adult. But that's not necessarily true, especially when you think about the fact that most victims are female and most offenders are male. So if that were true, then we would have more offenders would be female, right? And also, Certainly, there are some individuals who offend, who were offended as children. Absolutely, we know that that's happened, and we know that the cycle of abuse continues. We also know that a lot of people who were abused as children grow up to be advocates, grow up to take roles that protect children. And we know that sometimes individuals who have offended, there's been some studies that will show that some of them will say they've been offended or were victimized, because that might explain what they did, or that might, generate some level of understanding for their behavior, when that actually maybe wasn't the case, right? So they polygraphed some folks who made these assertions, and it didn't necessarily pan out. So I think it's too much to say certainly that all offenders have been offended as a youth, or that all youth who are offended can go on to offend. That connection is certainly there, but it's not as strong as the common, the general population would believe.
Thank you for clarifying that, definitely. Okay, and I have another question here that says, why do sex offenders say they can't control their actions? From what you have said, it sounds to me like they are master manipulators who often take time to plan and are very careful in their actions.
Sure. Behavior is a choice. It's always a choice. Even if they were abused themselves, even if they were in situations that were quite tragic for an upbringing, behavior is a choice. And you have some individuals who will take responsibility for that choice, and you'll have some who will either offer excuses or minimize or justify or find another way to divert blame. Sometimes that's because there's a great deal of shame. Sometimes that's because the offender is, truly remorseful and very embarrassed and very shameful of what they've done. And it's just too hard to admit. And I don't want to admit to my spouse. I don't want to admit to my support system who has been with me through this. And I've been saying it's a false allegation, and it's just too devastating for me to tell them that this had really happened, right? So sometimes it's that. Sometimes it is just another manipulation. Sometimes it is just somebody who's trying to find a way to blame the victim or not take responsibility. So there's many different reasons why. And then there are a number of individuals who do come through treatment. The vast majority that I've treated over the years, or that have been involved in the treating, that do come to the place where they recognize that they made the choice to engage in this behavior, that it was their fault and only their fault, and that it is their responsibility to make sure that they never engage in that type of behavior again. And if that means that there are certain things, like an alcoholic who can never go back to being a social drinker, it might mean that this offender can never watch pornography again, even adult pornography. They can never be alone with a child again. They can never do some of these things that other people can do. And they are willing to make those changes in their life because they don't want to be responsible for having another victim. So, it can run the gamut from people who refuse to take any responsibility to people who show what appears to be real genuine remorse and want to have their life course look different going forward.
Okay, I have two last questions for you, okay, and then I'll promise we'll let everyone go. Of course, it looks like we really do have engaged folks, because we still have over 160 people with us, and we're going long over. So my two questions, is chronic bedwetting and a lack of control over bladder in general, kind of with teens, is that a potential sign of past abuse?
So that's a really good question. So sometimes with any trauma, when kids have undergone trauma, we see regression. So you might see, for example, I'll use the fire example that I used earlier. If there was a fire in the home, you might see that your 8-year-old, who has long past potty training, is now starting to have bedwetting problems, right? And so anytime there's regression, that can certainly be a sign of trauma. Sometimes bedwetting can be a sign of sexual abuse because maybe the offender isn't going to mess with me if I've, wet my pants, and kids have learned that. So that can be. But there can also be, a number of other medical reasons for why that might be happening, or anxiety reasons for why that might be happening. I think it goes back to the, we don't want to overreact and we don't want to underreact. I think it makes sense to pay attention to a lot of these things that, we notice and that aren't typical. And it might mean that we have a conversation, or that we lean in, or we watch a little closer. But what we don't want to do is go from, observing X to believing that that means Y has happened, because there's a whole bunch of additional possibilities in there that we want to make sure and consider as well.
Sorry, I was on mute. I'm so sorry. Okay, last question, and it's more so kind of just something that's been talked about in the chat box here. So a number of folks are talking about this item, I guess you would say, is like a body safety box. It kind of teaches kids about their feelings and bodies, that their bodies are special. Just wondering if you've heard of it, if it's something you recommend. It looks like one foster parent brought it up, and has a number of other households interested.
Google something real quick and see if I know it under another name. What was it, a body safety box?
Body safety box is what they called it, yes. So looks like bodysafetybox.com.
I should know about, but I don't.
Well, hey, who knew that you were going to show up and possibly learn something tonight? You got some pretty wise folks.
It says evidence-based, which is always something to look for. So I don't know anything about that. I'll be interested in learning about that. Thank you, whoever told me about that. The only thing I have noticed so far is it does say evidence-based, and so that's always a good sign. That means that somebody has taken the time to do some research and see if this might be effective. But I will read this when we are done, so I apologize if I don't know the answer to that, but thank you to whoever brought it to my attention.
Hey, that's okay. We can't expect you to know everything this evening. We have had glowing remarks, a number of folks that said, their eyes were very much opened this evening. I've seen, I can think of like 5-7 households who have said that. So, of course, I sincerely appreciate your time, Dr. Benson. We had well over 200 people in attendance this evening. I shouldn't say that, well over 200 households. So definitely well over 250 people here joining us this evening. And with that being said, those of you who are still hanging on with us, I will go ahead and email that evaluation either yet tonight, if not tomorrow morning. And with that, you will be able to get the evaluation complete, and from that, there is a downloadable certificate. And so that certificate would work for licensed foster homes. It's kind of for you just to have your own record. And then I will go in turn submit the licensing piece to all the agencies. Of course, I have someone at my door. Of course, that's what happens, right? With that being said, your licensing agency should know you should be able to have a certificate for your own records as well. And with that, basically, you should be good to go for all of your licensing needs. And I think with that, we should be good to go for the rest of the night. So if you have any other questions, go ahead and email me. Reach out to the training center. We do have our next session with Dr. Stacy Benson in 3 weeks from this evening. Crazy to think that will be September 1st. I'm in disbelief. I don't know how I feel about that with September around the corner, but at least we have something to look forward to in September, right? And with that, that'll be the last of our planned series with Dr. Benson. We'll see if we maybe bring her back for additional pieces down the road. And our last one, we're going to talk about that notion If the youth in your home, the youth in your care is maybe sexually offended, kind of what do you do now? How do you support them? How do you keep them accountable? How do you keep them safe for themselves, around others, that sort of thing. So with that, we have kept you long overdue. I very much appreciate your attentiveness and your questions tonight. Definitely appreciate your sharing your knowledge, Dr. Benson, as well. So
Thanks for having me. Thank you very much.
with that, everyone take care and have a good rest of your evening.
All right, I'm going to read about the safety box. So
Perfect. Have a good night.